as we talk about this next instantiation of tonight's programming, we will hear from Dr. Britt Chang, a very dear and beloved colleague of mine in the journey and friend, and the team from Menlo EDU who have been involved in this process overall. And so I don't want to take up too much more time. I want to invite Dr. Britta, I call her Britt, but Dr. B sometimes and Dr. Britt sometimes, but I want to invite Dr. Britt to bring forward the messaging, the interpretations, the inferences, the patterns, the themes that we were able to graciously hear as a team when she and her representative team did all of the data analysis to help tell this story. And so if we can shift over to the amazing Dr. Britt, I would appreciate that. And we're just going to move through those findings with some clarification about the process, but also elevating the story inside of the data.
Thank you so much, Dr. T. You can call me Britt, Britta, whatever you want. You know, I am down. The grace you bring to the work that you do, that we get to do together, is inspirational to me. And I am super excited to be in conversation with you and with this whole team, this whole community tonight. I'm going to share my screen. I do want to say that the team is extraordinarily honored to have been part of the Teacher Truth Project in conducting a survey. I just want to make sure, just get a thumbs up from somebody that the slides are showing as they should be. Thank you all, you are wonderful. So I'm really honored to share the survey, the Teacher Truth Survey findings for you on behalf of the team that we brought together as under the banner of Menlo Education Research. And that includes Dr. Asha Joshi, who is on the call with us, and Dr. Radhika Gosavi, who's also on the call with us, I think, this evening as well. Thank you both for joining us. They will also be able to answer questions. Asha is going to be in the chat, making sure to answer questions as they might come up, but also feel free to interrupt. And let's get started. So we're all here in celebration of Black educators, and what we know as a group that Black educators are critical to our society is also extraordinarily well documented in research. And so I just want to tell you some of the highlights of what we found in research when we look at the role of Black educators in our education system. Well, first, we all know of the benefits for Black students, which actually can translate into student learning, with higher standardized test scores in reading and math. We also know that there's deeper learning in the classroom that's not well measured by standardized test scores, but this is a very interesting outcome in the research, as well as academic persistence outcomes. In 2017, a study was conducted that showed that Black children who have at least one Black teacher in 3rd, 4th, or 5th grade are 39% less likely to drop out of high school and 19% more likely to aspire to attend four-year college. We know that Black educators have benefits for students of all backgrounds because they identify and disrupt conscious and unconscious racial and cultural biases, and more often have an orientation to social justice in their instructional practices. We also know, and this is some of the work by Andre Perry, that the benefits of Black educators extend to neighborhoods and even local economies via community building and sustainability, including housing and land value, et cetera. So we know of the value of Black teachers in addition to the moral imperative to have Black educators as part of our education system. And despite this knowledge, there is a recruitment and retention threat that we're facing. In 2019, Education Trust West conducted a study that showed us that more than 250,000 California students are in schools without a teacher of their same race, that over 100,000 students attend a school in California where every teacher is white, and more than half the schools in California don't have a single Black teacher. In our small group right now, Che just told the story of her son who is in 10th grade, who has had one academic Black teacher in his career in California. When we consider the moment that we're in, as Dr. Mosley said so beautifully at the beginning of the meeting, we're in this pandemic. And we know from a survey done in March 2021 that 54% of educators surveyed, all ethnic backgrounds, 54 said they were considering leaving the profession in the next 2 years. When we look at the intersection of the pandemic with our recruitment and retention of educators of color, we are really at an inflection point where it's absolutely imperative that we understand and support the experiences of Black educators. So we did this survey definitely in service of that goal. We asked the question, what have Black educators experienced over the past 2 years in their workplace with regard to race and racism? And so just a couple of details that I want you to know is that the survey was co-designed by the folks at Menlo Education Research with the Teacher Truth team and with a set of advisors. I identify as a multiracial researcher, and it felt absolutely important to have as many Black voices at the table, as well as those who are still in the classroom, because I have not been in the classroom in almost 15 years. So it seemed very important to make sure that while we were doing this research, that we were in conversation with those who would be taking the survey. We wanted the survey to be about 20 minutes total to complete. So we had quite a few closed-ended, but also some open-ended questions. And I'll just nod my hat, tip my hat right now to Asha Joshi, who helped do the research to find those very important closed-ended scales that we used in order to do this research, and was at the crux of that. Thank you, Asha. The responses were collected between January and February of 2021. And the analysis that we've done here, also done by Dr. Gosavi, thank you for that, are the voices of 206 educators from across the country, 92 of whom were from California. Okay. So our respondents, the data that I'm talking about this evening, are 206, but 205 responded about their what they identified as their ethnic or racial background as either Black, African American, biracial, multiracial. We had a good split between respondents who identified as female and those who identified as male. We had 100 plus respondents who identified their primary roles as teacher, but we also had almost 100 respondents who either had a dual role as teacher and also administrator, coach, et cetera, or identified their primary role as administrator, coach, et cetera. And you can see that breakdown here. And then it's important to say that 86%, almost 90% of the respondents said that they'd been in the same educator position for almost 2 years. That's really important because the survey questions asked respondents about their experiences in the workplace in the past 2 years. And I'll just ask you to keep that in mind, because a lot of research that you'll read about is actually asking folks to report their experiences of racism or of sexism across their lifetime. This survey is really about the past 2 years. So just a quick summary of the findings. What were Black educators' experiences of race and racism in the past 2 years in their workplace? The most common type of racism experienced by our participants were when colleagues made assumptions about the similarity of people based on their race. And that was a full 90% of our respondents said that they had had an experience of this type in the past 2 years. 84% of our respondents talked about experiencing racism in the form of workplace isolation. One example of that, which was reported by 44% of our respondents, was when I interact with colleagues in a position of power in my workplace, they are usually of a different racial background. 83% of our respondents talked about experiencing racism in the form of colleagues demonstrating fear based on their race. An example of that, which was expressed by 43% of our respondents, was at least one colleague labeled my behaviors as or responses as aggressive or threatening. 82% said they experienced racism by being either alienated, or ignored. And similarly, 82% said that they experienced racism in the past 2 years when a colleague questioned their intellectual capacity based on their race. The full detail of the results is in a report that is now available on teachertruth.org. The least common experience of racism reported by a staggering 63% of our respondents was racism that involved being subjugated to sexual stereotypes and inappropriate behaviors. That was the least common reported. I'll break that down for you. 52% of our respondents who identified as female reported racism associated with sexual harassment. And 74% of our male respondents, or those who identified as male, reported an experience of racism related to inappropriate sexual behavior. And while that number is actually really high in other research, compared to other research, we also found in the research trends that educators who identify as male and with a minority group, either ethnic, disability, or other, are actually reporting very high frequency of sexual harassment in the workplace. I just want to put a little context around those numbers, which are astoundingly high, painfully so. Those numbers are commensurate with other studies that we read. And when we look at education, educators in particular, the experiences of racism are double those in other labor sectors. So here in education, we have a very specific and extraordinarily rampant problem that we really must address. So we asked our participants, what were the strategies that they used to navigate experiences of racism in the workplace? How did they manage in this environment? The most common strategy that we heard from respondents fell into a category of caring for self, which are those things that we do to support our own physical and mental health. Self-protection strategies, which include validating, self-validation, having a sense of pride in one's own excellence, but also enforcing boundaries between work and personal life, which is, to me, really quite a thing when we hear about how relational the work that the teachers that we heard from today do. To have to draw those boundaries in order to self-protect is really counterproductive to being an educator. Participating in support networks is a key strategy, as were religious and spiritual practices, although less frequently reported, as well as self-censoring, which are those practices of shifting language, body language, attire, and so on to de-emphasize differences between oneself and colleagues. We also saw that there were a lot of strategies that educators in the classroom were using to navigate issues of race in their workplace, including themes of social justice in their instruction, addressing American history and the roles of Black Americans in historical events for students, and also becoming more familiar with Black scholars and leaders in the field in order to consider their own practice. So these survey findings just really scratch the surface. Even if you look at the full report, the survey really does just scratch the surface into this space. We really do want to suggest that research into the institutional dynamics that reify, but then also disrupt patterns of racism in the educational workplace are critical to the functioning of the education system. We really need to be doing the work that's being done here this evening, talking about strategies of support and to redress these experiences of racism. Some of the strategies we heard about in the survey and that we also hear about here tonight, professional networks, voice in the workplace, instructional supports, are all key. What we really need to be doing is thinking about how to support teachers and educators in using those mechanisms in their day-to-day, which is to say, we should be thinking about how to do teacher truth in the workplace more broadly. And we are very, very, very excited to see teacher truth grow out into the world after today's launch, and for the role that we've had in this project, and for the role that we might be able to play in the future to support teacher truth. We are entirely grateful.
Thank you, Dr. Britt. And I'm going to ask if we can just take a few more moments to see if there are any questions coming in from this amazing constellation of folks who've joined us this evening. But I think I just saw Erica clap. So I want to honor that clap and just take a moment to clap up those findings and an overview of the research that Dr. Britt just shared. If everybody could come off your mics, if we were in the room, I'd be jumping around like Oprah used to do in the mid 90s, asking you all to stand up, shout out, and give a clap for Dr. Britt and her team. And so far, before, let me just see, no questions thus far. We've had a few requests for the deck, the information, the report. We got that coming to you hot off the press. And I know that you're going to be looking forward to the amazing teachers who have been contributing to this. So before we go there, and I turn it over to the incomparable Dr. Misha, one of my beloveds, I want to just take a few moments to see, Dr. Britt, could we ask a few questions of you?
Of course.
Okay, so one of the things that I was thinking about as we went through this process, could you share with the beloved community here, as you were going through the experience, what surprised you, what concerned you, and what did you have hope for?
Well, I think the findings are not a surprise. We know these findings. And yet, as we put them together, the power of them continue to surprise me. Every day we would sit down and talk about, analyze, write about, communicate to the team what we were learning. It was always it was always a journey of trying to figure out how to relate emotionally to them and what our role was, what our responsibility was to those findings. So that's just what my experience has been. Hope for the strategies that we read about, that we heard about from participants, have been the things that the Teacher Truth team does so beautifully. I have hope that there are organizations and networks that can make those strategies more a part of the day-to-day of our educators, of our Black educators and our educators of color. I do have hope for that. And I see the commitment of folks when I talk about these findings. Every single person I talk to is down. They want to know how to help. They want to know how to get involved. They want to know who funded that. Let's go talk to those people again and see how we can, support the work coming out of Teacher Truth. So I'm just deeply hopeful for that. I think the question of our responsibility to our survey participants and to our teachers here is a deep question that I'm very excited to hear thoughts about how we can support them and what we can do.
Wonderful. I appreciate your characterization of what it took to do the analysis while standing in a very, I think, unique role. I mean, traditionally, when we think of how researchers function and the way that they're typically trained, rarely do they characterize those who are contributing the data in the way that you just did, let alone the analytics and the process that it takes to take numerical and narrative experiences in such a calculated and intentional way, while also holding the humanity of, say, each of the teachers, each of the contributing educators that participated in the survey. And so before we transition, I also want to ask for your insights. What are some of the ways that we can think about a research agenda that builds on what we've learned so far in the power and the beauty of these stories, as well as these findings that, for me, ache at the heart of the matter. Having been Black as long as I've known myself, and in this work, the findings were not surprising to me. And often those strategies that you presented that were really a constellation of how individuals find within themselves the emotional, mental, spiritual, physical fortitude to be in these spaces that aren't necessarily welcoming, loving, embracing, and joyful, leads me to deeper questions about how do we use this research and the findings to propel a research agenda that deepens some of those strategies in meaningful ways for the individual, as well as the systems in which they serve.
Amen. That's exactly it. We have to take these strategies and we have to formalize them. We have to make them part of the professional practice. I'd love to talk with the California Teachers Association. I'd love to talk with the California Science Teachers Association, California Math Teachers Association, and figure out how our professional networks can start to understand the importance of this work, and make it more clear that it has to be part of the institution's responsibility as well, to embody these strategies in the day-to-day. It has to be part of the work that gets done, and it's going to have to be forever. This is not a strategy that gets put into place we do for a couple of years because it's our DEI work this year, and now we're going to move on to something else. This has to be a constant sense-making process that our educators can engage in together to make sense of what's going on in their classrooms and in their personal workplace as well. And I can't overemphasize that relational dimension of the work that we hear about from our teachers, and how we heard from the respondents that they have to actually create boundaries between their personal and work lives. As we know as educators, I'm not a classroom teacher, haven't been for a long time, but we know that that's relational work at its heart. And so this really has to be a sense-making and supportive practice in the workplace as part of the profession, not as something folks have to do on their own, pulling it together in survival mode.
Beautiful. Thank you for that. And the confirmation of the self to system transformation, and the work has to live on all sides, 360. So rich, so meaningful. And as we're continuing to expand into the evening, I want to affirm that we will have more of these discussions to build on this work.